I have the pleasure of introducing Lisa Guernsey. Lisa is a senior fellow and strategic advisor in the Education Policy Program at New America. And Lisa's writing and editing sits at the intersection of literacy, including digital and media literacy, equity in education systems, including libraries, schools, and digital environments, and the science of learning. Lisa co-founded and co-leads the Learning Sciences Exchange, a fellowship program. And before coming to New America, Lisa was a staff writer at the New York Times and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And I just want to say it's just a real pleasure to be with all of you. Laura Bornfriend, my colleague and friend, really wishes she could be here to moderate this session. She's just put in a lot of incredible work into doing the organizing of this, and I know she's listening, but she's come down with a pretty awful sickness and infection, and so I'm really glad to be able to step into her shoes for a moment and take you through this with these amazing panelists that we have here. So the first webinar, as you all may remember, explored again, why kindergarten is such a pivotal year. And that was really talking about kindergarten as the first universal access point for children. It's the first time all children have the opportunity to be in a public school setting. And that it means it really should, and it can be this sturdy bridge connecting pre-K and the early grades. Today, we're going to discuss strategies that educators can use to better bridge pre-K and kindergarten, discussing the research behind those strategies and how to ensure culturally and linguistic affirming learning opportunities and environments are afforded to our kindergartners, and also how to use play, exploration, interactions, and relationships to teach in the ways that young children learn best. So it's an incredible lineup of folks we have here today, and I'm going to give you a quick introduction to them, and then we'll launch into a conversation. I will note, though, as a soccer fan, I will note that we have a little bit of competition right now for this webinar, and that there is an important game going on elsewhere, but we're not going to get too distracted by that U.S. men's soccer game right now, and we'll try not to give too many spoilers either for those of us who might be recording the game to watch later. But I'm just really thrilled to be with all of you. So we have our presenters today include Dr. Nell Duke, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Early Literacy Success at Stand for Children. She also holds a position as Professor of Education and Psychology at the University of Michigan and has been named one of the most influential education scholars in the United States, according to Ed Week. We have Dr. Anya Hurwitz, who is the Executive Director of Sobrato Early Academic Language, also known as SEAL, S-E-A-L. And she's worked for 25 years in education as a teacher, a school leader, and within the nonprofit sector. Dr. Deborah Leong is with us, the co-founder and president of Tools of the Mind and professor emerita of psychology at Metropolitan State University of Denver. Dr. Leong developed the Tools of the Mind approach with Dr. Bedrova and has written several books, articles, and educational videos on the Vygotskian approach to psychology and the development of play. And we also have Kathy Hirsch-Pathak with us. Dr. Hirsch-Pathak is professor of psychology at Temple University and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Dr. Hirsch-Pathak was declared a scientific entrepreneur from the American Association of Psychology and has written 16 books and more than 250 publications on these topics. And I've had the great pleasure over the years of working with many of you, writing about your work. I'm so thrilled to have you with us today. In particular, Kathy and I are co-founders together, along with Roberta Golenkoff, of the Learning Sciences Exchange Fellowship Program. So Kathy, it's just a real thrill to be with you on this as well. So we're going to jump in and maybe, Kathy, you can answer this first question that I want to ask all of you, which is, what are some of the most important research findings on teaching and learning in kindergarten?
Well, Lisa, thank you for that question. And let's have the next slide, where I hazard a guess of 3 of the top findings. I think number 1, we have learned that full-day kindergarten gives better results, both academically and socially, than half-day kindergarten. So if you have a choice, full day kindergarten wins. The second thing I think we've learned is that even though Daphne Basak has a very famous paper showing us that kindergarten has become the new first grade, we have to stop this because it really doesn't work for kindergarten. We have to stop what is being called the schoolification, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And third, I think we know what to do because children learn best in active, playful learning environments. So next slide, please. What I'm going to urge us all to do is to stop the schoolification. Schoolification is this great term that has been bantered around lately, and it really talks about how we are starting to push down all of the academic work that used to be in first grade and second grade and shove it into kindergarten. We have kids who are sitting long hours in group time, not getting up, not running, not playing, and sadly, not learning. What we are also learning is that the unconstrained skills, as McCormick called it in 1921, build what we're calling these constrained skills of content like reading and math. What do I mean by that? There's actual brain data to show us that when you are in relationships, whether it's with peers or whether it's with teachers or with parents, what happens is you build better communication skills and collaboration skills. Those collaboration and communication skills form the foundation for learning content. And yes, strong language skills are not only important for vocabulary and learning to read, but also for early mathematics and STEM learning. On top of content, we build critical thinking, and even kindergartners have marvelous critical thinking skills. And you've seen that when they argue with you. Creative innovation and creative ideas build on content as well. And then confidence to take a risk, to dare to fail. Because when they dare to fail, they learn growth mindset, and they learn the kind of grit and persistence that we want them to learn. Turns out you need all of these skills, not just the content, if you're going to succeed. Next slide, please. Now, this breadth of skills is nurtured in what we can call playful learning. We used to use the kindergarten data to just compare direct instruction to free play. And in those conditions, direct instruction really at least offers some information to young children. Free play, which is wonderful for kids and important for kids, doesn't get them to reading and math and to some of the skills we want them to develop. So in our work, we've developed a sweet spot that we call guided play. Guided play and games are adult initiated. So you set up the classroom, or you set up the children's museum, or you curate what we want the kids to engage in. But the children drive their learning within that environment. And when we have guided play, we have certain characteristics that are on the next slide. Guided play matches how human brains learn. Human brains learn best when they're active, not passive. When they're engaged, not distracted. When information is meaningful, not disconnected. When you're learning with someone else. Doesn't mean you can't learn solo, but you learn best with others. When it's iterative and you get to explore and find out what works and what doesn't. And yes, when it's joyful, not boring. If you take those characteristics and you put them toward a learning goal, whether that learning goal be collaboration or it be content in reading and math, children succeed better. And in fact, we just wrote a report for the Lego Foundation, and the Yadan Foundation just came out. It is on the Lego Foundation website, and it's called Where Global Science Meets Playful Learning, and you can see all the data. Next slide, please. Preliminary research demonstrates that this kind of approach, and we again have reviewed this approach in our new book, Making Schools Work, actually can help us change not the content that we're teaching, but really the way we are engaging and teaching young children in kindergarten. And what are we finding? Whether we look in more or less resource schools, we are seeing increases in those more standardized measures of reading and math, but also decreases in referrals to occupational therapy and special education. And here's one for you. We're seeing increases in teacher happiness. This is why you went into teaching in the first place. So there's actual evidence that's supporting these approaches that's been used in schools. So the theory is holding up. Next slide, please. If we use a simple equation, what I call the three-part equation, start with the cultural values that are meaningful to the community that you're working in. Add the how of learning, which is active, engaged, meaningful, socially iterative, and joyful, plus a learning goal. And then add to that the what of learning, what we call the 6 C's, an integrated systemic model: collaboration, communication, content, critical thinking, creative innovation, and confidence. And I think we have, dare I say, a checklist that can guide us in how to make every lesson plan a little more exciting, to get the kids out of all that circle time. You can still have some, but you don't need that much of it. And we can be happier in our teaching and have deeper learning for our students. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Kathy. And I will just pass it right on over now to Deb Leong. And I think Deb may not have slides, but we'd love to hear your answer to that question as well, about what research matters for teaching and learning in kindergarten.
Thank you. So I really agree with what Kathy has said, and want to address the issue of the fact that if we teach kindergartners in the way that they learn best, that we really do have to pay attention to how we teach. And in fact, the how we teach is as important as what we teach. So how we teach young children influences not just the content that they learn, but it sets up learning habits and becomes a blueprint for further learning. So again, how we teach is as important as what we teach. So I'm going to talk about 3 strands of research that addresses how we teach kindergartners. And the first is the research on play. Second, the research on self-regulation and executive functions. And the third is research on social relationships in the classroom and how that affects learning. So the research on play, Kathy has really presented compelling evidence about guided play and playful learning that increases motivation, curiosity, mental engagement, and in turn influences how much children remember and learn, and the kinds of habits that they establish as they play. The second set of research focuses on the development of self-regulation, because we know from a lot of research now that some children fail in learning, and it's because they never really became self-regulated learners. They have difficulty learning on their own, and many children are really dependent on teachers to help them learn. So learning by yourself, independently on purpose, is something that we really strive for in the whole elementary school time, not just in kindergarten. And neuroscience research shows that self-regulated learning really depends on the development of something called executive functions. And these were actually discussed by Ellen Galinsky and Ryan Lee James in the first webinar of this series. So I'm just going to kind of summarize the research on executive functions. So we know that executive functions are these foundational abilities that underlie cognitive and social emotional development. And they are very highly correlated with academics. In fact, they are more highly correlated with academics than IQ and social class. They allow children to remember on purpose, to reflect on what they're learning, to focus attention. So executive functions allow the child to master their own cognitive and social emotional behaviors. And executive functions are developed between birth and 7 years of age. And so they're not fully developed at 5, which is the kindergarten age. So a lot of the academic demands of learning literacy and math require more executive functions than most kindergartners have. And this is part of the reason Kathy mentioned about not schoolifying kindergarten, where you're pushing down the demands and the ways of teaching that work when you're in 3rd grade, but really require executive function abilities that are beyond what kindergartners have. So the good news is that research shows that executive functions are malleable and can be improved with strategically designed classroom activities. So how we teach kindergartners needs to include scaffolding executive functions development so children can become self-regulated learners. The third set of research has to do with how social relationships affect learning in the classroom. So we know from research that teachers, the way teachers interact with children, the kind of classroom management systems they have, how they those things can affect motivation, feelings of self-worth, how children learn, and even the development of self-regulation. Children's relationships with peers also affects their feelings of motivation, feelings of self-worth, mental health, and how they learn. So not having friends and making mistakes in front of other children and being embarrassed, having negative interactions with the teacher, all of these influence learning in the classroom. And I particularly want to call out the research on ability grouping, because that research shows that ability grouping in kindergarten actually sets up negative social interaction and builds inequality into the classroom for many children, especially those that are in the lower reading groups, that is very difficult for them to recover from in later years. So we need to think about how we organize the classroom and how that also affects learning. And finally, I wanted to reiterate Kathy's point that there is research that shows that teaching the way children learn, kindergarten children learn, using play, emphasizing self-regulated learning and social relationships, these result in strong child outcomes. And the results from 2 randomized controlled trials of tools of the mind, kindergartens, we found that the researchers found that there were higher levels of achievement in literacy and math than controls. We closed the achievement gap in literacy and math for at-risk children whose home language is not English, children from lower reading groups. We increased levels of self-regulation and executive functions, more positive peer interactions, fewer behavior problems. And these gains in learning accelerated in the next grade, in 1st grade. So we actually changed the learning trajectory for children, and there was no summer loss between kindergarten and 1st grade. So it shows that teaching in the way kindergartners learn really has proven positive outcomes. And I'll put, if you're interested, you can email me and I can send you the research summary of the points that I've just made. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. We'll go now to Anya Hurwitz at SEAL.
Hi, great to be here with everyone and to build from the amazing ideas that have been shared so far. I also want to thank New America and the Grade Level Reading Campaign for framing this conversation about kindergarten in such an expansive manner. There's such a strong tendency to be reductive within these kinds of conversations. And that pressure and force comes from many sources: political, economic, and of course, the sense of urgency to address equity. The pandemic has only intensified all our fears and concerns for our young children. And nevertheless, as most researchers and scholars understand, and especially those here today, but Furthermore, what teachers will tell you time and time again, their charge, their task as they work to build learning environments and experiences for all children to thrive cannot be reduced to a small set of best practices or one program. But what needs to happen to ensure all children succeed and flourish in kindergarten is quite complex. So given that robust framing, the elements I'd like to share and contribute to this conversation are meant to be seen as a part of a layered, interconnected picture that we are together painting of high quality kindergarten learning experiences and environments. So first, and you've heard this already, I want to focus also on engagement as a critical aspect of kindergarten. What at my organization at SEAL, we often describe, and I think Kathy also and Deb called it joyful learning. Engagement is key to internal motivation, which of course is essential for all levels of human growth and development. When children are engaged, when they're interested, when they're curious, the learning is deep. Children are born with scientific minds. We talked about them as critical thinkers. They're natural sociologists and historians. They ask big questions, big important questions. And our job is to structure classroom and learning experiences to build on those innate assets, those funds of knowledge, that curiosity. At SEAL, we work to implement this through thematic learning, thematic units where teachers can go deep for extended periods of time and pull in really interesting content while they simultaneously are building literacy skills, language skills, math skills, socio-emotional skills. Furthermore, the next piece I want to uplift is the integration of language development across everything. Children are language sponges. Their brains at this age are wired for language. So weaving intentional scaffolds, structures, and strategies to support language development across all aspects of learning is essential. And doing so in ways that are responsive to dual language learners is ever more essential. That can look like turn and talk, where teachers regularly have students turn to each other to discuss and answer questions, where they engage collaboratively with the stories, the topics, the content being learned. Content-based chants are another great way to build language development. Songs that are fun and catchy and include concepts and vocabulary from the content that is being explored together. Students get exposure to language, to the vocabulary, and the teachers can actually use those chants as text to more fully explore the ideas and the vocabulary together. Dramatic play that is steeped in content is another powerful strategy. So if a unit is about the life cycle of insects, there are play areas that include ways for children to become etymologists, to immerse themselves in the study of insects through play. I think that qualifies as one of the forms of play that Kathy was describing. And then of course, narrative retell is a tried and true language and literacy development strategy. So when we include stories that also connect to content, to the thematic learning, the language development is ever more rich. There are so many strategies that build language, but teachers need time, they need space, they need support, they need training, they need coaching that increase their ability to be intentional about their planning, making sure the strategies build from each other so the learning becomes ever more rich and deep. The language development opportunities are infinite, but there must be that intentionality, those structures and scaffolds to ensure that all students have access and support. And lastly, I want to make sure to elevate how critical it is that our kindergarten classrooms are culturally and linguistically affirming. It is essential that we build from the assets that children bring, their funds of knowledge, their background knowledge, and their lived experiences. That is the basis for strong relationships, for building learning environments where children are fully seen and feel mirrored, while we simultaneously create windows out into the world for them to learn and grow. A commitment to home language development is a powerful way to do this. That means finding ways to welcome home languages and cultures into our classroom. So these three elements, deep engagement, language development across all content, and culturally and linguistically affirming learning, do not live isolated in a vacuum, but rather they're interconnected, they're absolutely relate to the focus areas that my colleagues here are discussing. And furthermore, these elements support all students And for children who speak a language other than English at home, they are absolutely critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. We'll now go to Nell Duke.
Hi, everyone. Adding my gratitude for the opportunity to be on this august panel and to be with all of you. For my 3 minutes, I'm going to focus on, if you could pull the slides up, thanks. For my 3 minutes, I'm going to focus on the sort of, I'm not seeing the slides, I'm sorry. Are they up? No. Okay, well, I'll just swing it. What I want to argue is that the most important research finding that we have about kindergarten is the number of research findings we have about kindergarten. We know from research on kindergarten that there are so many different techniques and instructional practices that are beneficial to young children. We know, as you can see in the next slide, that in my area of early literacy development, there are so many contributors to long-term outcomes that develop in kindergarten. Children's concepts of print, their phonemic awareness, their knowledge of specific letter-sound relationships, their morphological awareness, which for those of you who don't know is their understanding of the smallest meaningful units in words. So things like prefixes and suffixes and so forth, lots of evidence there that that's really important to develop. Children's ability to decode and encode words is important at this age. We have handwriting development to engage in kindergarten, developing genre knowledge, like understanding basic structures of informational text is beneficial in kindergarten, research finds. Comprehension strategies, like paying attention to the characters, the setting, the problem, and the resolution within a story, very important in kindergarten. There are also writing strategies, like chunking a big long word in order to spell it, that are important at this age. You've already heard a really eloquent description of how important oral language is in kindergarten. Lots of research evidence around that, especially around developing vocabulary knowledge in children this age. In addition to that, we have our content areas, and you might think, why are content areas on a literacy list? But science and social studies content knowledge and process knowledge, how to do science and do social studies, actually has been shown to be quite predictive of kids' long-term reading comprehension success. And this is not even an exhaustive list. So I think the fundamental question that we face is, how do we get all these wonderful practices that you're hearing about into the length of day that we have in kindergarten? Even if we look at a full day kindergarten curriculum, how do we fit into that day all of the practices and ideas and constructs that we need to address? So I engaged for a forthcoming chapter in a handbook of the science of early literacy, engaged in a thought experiment where I took recommendations from different organizations. How much science should there be? How much social studies should there be in a kindergarten or first, second grade day? How much mathematics? How much time for lunch, for recess? And go ahead and put in the chat, if you add up all of the recommended amounts of time that should be spent on different parts of the day in kindergarten, what kind of number do you think you get? Go ahead and put in the chat. I'm just interested in what you're guessing. So I see several guesses of 10 hours, 8 hours, 16 hours, 3 hours, 9 hours, 12 hours, a big range. Yep, 40 hours. And yeah, I mean, if you're a classroom teacher, you know this pressure all too well. The answer in our analysis was that if you just did the bare minimum that's being recommended, it would take over 9 hours. And that didn't include any transition times, no bathroom times, lots of other things that teachers will tell you are important to our school day. And so what this tells us is that we have got to tackle how to make a manageable day for teachers, how to get all of the most important, highest priority practices, experiences, and constructs into a day that in the US is about 6.5 hours long. So on the next slide, I'm just going to suggest a few strategies to think about for fitting it all in. And this is something I write and present about. So welcome you to check out resources at my website or my feed and Twitter. But one of the strategies, you can go ahead and put them all up on the screen. So one of the strategies is taking a really hard look at how we're spending our time now and making sure that if there are practices in there that aren't developmentally appropriate or really don't work based on research, for example, lots of stuff that happens in calendar time every day really should go. So clearing out what doesn't work and then engaging in a practice some of you may have heard of called time analysis, where you look at every minute of the day to figure out where is that time going. For example, transitions often eat up more time than they need to. So looking for that kind of thing, PA announcements in your school that go on for 10 minutes, that is, time away from instruction and something to really think twice about. And then finally, working toward what Michael Presley and colleagues called instructional density, which is like how much are you achieving within any portion of your day, looking for how you can address multiple areas of literacy development at once, and looking for opportunities for interdisciplinary instruction where you're developing language and you're developing literacy and you're developing science and math all within an interdisciplinary opportunity. So these are some of the strategies that I encourage everyone to think about when we together tackle this really challenging question of how to do all of the wonderful things that you're hearing about over the course of a kindergarten day. Thanks.
Fabulous. Here, let me get my video back on. It's been really, it's exciting to hear each of you describe this, how tightly the research is tied to the strategies. And we'll get into these strategies, I think, a little bit more in our discussion now, because getting down to that brass tacks, that practicality, I mean, now that's such a great point that you bring up, like, how do we do this within the hours that we have? And feel free, for those of you who are listening, put questions in the chat or in the Q&A for us that relate to these practical questions as well. I'm going to go back to Kathy for a minute, just to answer a question to help us visualize guided play. And maybe in reflecting on what we've also just heard from your co-presenters, and thinking about it, perhaps, Kathy, just to add into this question a little bit, in the context of now, where we have the supposedly post-pandemic, but a lot of post-pandemic pressure going on right now to get kids back in the classroom and learning. And so what are the tensions there that you might be yourself hearing? I know I've certainly heard them in many forums. And how do we recognize how to use guided play within this context that we're in today?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers because I think there's lots of questions bounded up in there, and I'll see if we can pull some of them apart. The first is I do want to speak to what Anya and Deborah and Nell were talking about. There's a lot to achieve in a school day. And as you know, I keep putting that learning goal in there because I think if we don't have some constraints on what's going on in that school day, then the kids will have a fun day, but they won't come out learning anything, and we owe them much more than that. What I think Anya and Deborah are doing, which is so exciting to me, is by using themes and by using carefully intentional, and this speaks to what Phil said in the chat, learning, what we're able to do is overlap some of those times. So I'm going to take you to a kindergarten right now to give you a sense of what that looks like, and I want to do it super briefly. Kindergarten that we worked with took the theme of weather. And there was a group of kids that were carefully sitting at their table, and I saw this one kid with a cardboard box pointed at a map of the United States, just moving his hand. I had no idea what was going on here, but apparently the four of these kids had just written a weather report. And they told me about the high pressure that was coming in from the west and was going to create some sort of precipitation. Now I'm listening to high pressure, forecast, precipitation. These are great words. This is word knowledge. So we are building literacy. At the next table, kids had a dropper, and they took like water that they had in a bowl, and they had to measure how many drops of rain they could get into a circle of a particular circumference. All right, my point in raising that is that within a theme, you can overlap the science, which they're getting here, the literacy, and the math. And then they graphed it. And I thought this was pretty amazing for a kindergarten classroom. And all the kids felt like they could participate. So I think that's one way to get around these problems that we're talking about. Now, the biggest problem, though, is one that I saw from Jen. And that is, teachers aren't used to teaching this way. What do we do with that excess time that Nell just talked about? We're sitting in circle time, we're doing the weather report, we're doing the calendar, and we have to, I think, reassess what really matters and what doesn't, and change the frame. Again, not around content, but around the pedagogy that we use to achieve that content. And now I'll leave it to others.
Yeah, and Kathy, so building on that in terms of changing the pedagogy, I want to go to you next, Deb. And I know you have some slides as well that you may want to show, but if you can just talk a little bit more about tools of the mind and how it has addressed this issue of being able to use time in ways that layer all of this content for our children.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, can you put up my slides, please? So what I thought I'd do is sort of take people to a classroom and see what it looks like. So I'm going to talk about guided play and learning games first, and then I'll talk about learning conferences, and then I'll talk about creating a community of learners. So what we do is we follow, the children play the Magic Treehouse books. And so there are 12 of them, and they play them for about 4 to 5 weeks. And so if you go in at any time, you can see the entire class is turned into, for this one, pirates, and you have to walk the plank to get through the front door. And other themes follow this, the 12 books. They go to medieval England, they go to the Amazon, they go to the desert, all sorts of places. And so we use this experience to actually, children, they listen to the story and background information about this theme. They write and draw things that they want to remember, and then they make props and they dramatize the story in small groups. So we end up using the theme. They count golden doubloons instead of counting bears and things like this. So we use the make-believe play, and in this case, guided play, to teach listening comprehension, to teach phonics skills through their early writing, to teach social skills. They have to negotiate playing with a small group of other kids. They practice self-regulation by planning out the story they are going to act out and taking turns acting it out. Next slide. So we also have learning games that we use. So that's the next slide. No, you're on the right slide. Thank you. And these are self-correcting games, and children play them with a partner, and the partner is not necessarily at their level. They're self-correcting so that children can help each other, even though they may not be able to answer that specific question themselves. And so in the picture, you'll see this child is pulling out the word sack one letter at a time, and the child they're playing with has to sound it and then blend together to be a word. But the child who has it and knows what the word is because there's a picture on the back. So what you get is engaging, motivating play, error-free practice. Children learn to, they practice executive functions because the child they take turns doing it, and you're not supposed to blurt out the answer. And they engage in positive social interactions. And at the end of each of the games the children play, they make a little learning record, where they write down what they were practicing and what they learned from that experience. So the next slide shows how we use the learning, the records that children had from learning. And the teacher actually becomes a learning coach. She or he meets with the teachers on Friday, and they go over all the learning records, and the teacher is able to check to see if the child has really understood what they were practicing. the teacher helps children engage in self-reflection. Did I really understand? Did I remember? They discuss learning strategies and they plan and set learning goals. And so you see in the clipboard a picture of the learning goal. I think the learning goal was something like working on middle sounds. So the teacher's trying to help children develop an internal standard of knowing so that they know if they practiced enough, help children learn how to handle errors, know what it means, to give them emotional support for learning, and to talk about learning strategies. And this is the part about supporting and scaffolding the executive functions that many children in kindergarten don't have, because sometimes when you ask kids how they got an answer, their answer is that it popped into their head because they're unaware of the learning processes that actually went on in their heads. So the whole idea of this learning conference is for the teacher to help the children really make those learning processes be explicit for them and to learn how I learn. That's the whole goal. And the last slide shows we use a buddy system where children work with another child. And I'm meant to say that in the learning games, for example, you can organize those so children have different sets of words to practice, so you can actually individualize. So in the buddy system, children are paired with every other child in the classroom, regardless of the level of ability. And so this is our attempt to really stamp out the use of ability grouping by designing interactions so that children can really truly help each other. What the buddy helps the other child practice is learning strategies and how to work on learning their learning goals. So these two children are reading what they've written to each other, and one of the little girl can't read one of the words, and so her partner goes through reading strategies. One is, can you remember what you wrote? Another is, can you sound it out, for example. And so what this causes is that you create a classroom where children really care that their partner learns, and being a good study buddy is part of being a good classmate with your friends. And there's no embarrassment over errors, and children really try hard to reinforce each other, and you get a classroom where children really take pride in having helped themselves learn and help someone else learn as well.
Really wonderful. Thank you, Deb. I'm going to turn to Anya now, because I'm thinking back to a comment that you made about how important it's going to be to have these environments be built in ways that are culturally and linguistically affirming. And so, Anya, I wonder if you might be able to elaborate on that and describe some ways that schools and teachers can ensure that cultural and linguistic affirming environment is there for kids.
Yes, thank you. And there's been some chatting about this in the chat box as well. Overall, we know children should feel mirrored in school, that when children experience their whole self affirmed by school, then the learning environment, the conditions for them to be successful can be met. When they do not feel mirrored and affirmed, when school treats their culture and their language as a deficit, when the school culture creates a mismatch between home and school, children are forced to make choices and form opinions that are not healthy for them. They can form ideas about what is good, what is right, and what is not good. Children are naturally sociologists, and they understand power very quickly. There is absolutely, therefore, it's absolutely critical that we ensure that there is not a mismatch between home and school, and that children and families feel themselves mirrored in the learning experiences of kindergarten. So dual language programs are an explicit way to do this. These programs are innately affirming of the families of the target language. And when a dual language program is even just a pathway within a school that also has English instructed classrooms, we find in our work that it elevates, that by elevating another language instructionally, it shifts the culture of the whole school overall and welcomes and establishes a broader sense of inclusivity that emanates throughout. So dual language programs are kind of a no-brainer in that sense, but more generally in all schools, those without dual language programs, teachers and all staff should really deeply know their children and families, not just superficially, but substantively. That means welcoming them into the classroom, both physically as well as into the curriculum and the content. If teachers do not have the language skills of their students, they can invite family members to be language models, to read stories in their home languages, to share about their cultures and traditions. They can bring songs and books from their students' culture and language into the classroom. This is deeply meaningful for children and family members. Additionally, making sure that we explicitly value home language development and that we publicly value multilingualism has powerful impacts across schools and communities. So continually encouraging families to be speaking, to be developing home language with their children, and repeatedly expressing the value of bilingualism and biliteracy. One specific strategy that we use at SEAL is what we call homeschool connection activities, where children work with their families at home on activities that build from what they're learning in the school. It's at school, ideally in their home language. We encourage these to not be stressful, to be easy to do and flexible. And an example might be asking a family member to walk with their student around the block and observe any insects they see, discussing them, again, ideally in their home language, and drawing pictures. And these can even evolve so that some of the family members can come into the classroom to share together, et cetera. And we'll share a video we have actually from a preschool classroom. And so one of the things that, and I see this in one of the chats, some of those strategies that we use in preschool more readily, we need to be including them in our kindergarten classrooms, like welcoming families more regularly into the classroom. So again, making sure our classrooms are culturally and linguistically affirming is an essential part of creating a high quality, effective kindergarten experience for all children.
Yeah, thank you, Anya. And I'm going to throw a question back maybe to all of you. We just have a couple of minutes now before we go to our panel of practitioners. But I did, just to kind of stay on this point of engaging families and the cultural inclusiveness that you're describing, Anya, I wonder if each of you might very briefly be able to describe for us how to use some of these strategies, or maybe it's just one strategy that would become top of mind to re-engage families, especially those that have felt kind of disconnected after the pandemic, and those that are serving children with multiple needs as well, which is a big issue, obviously across all grades, but in kindergarten that becomes very, very clear very, very quickly. And sometimes it's the first time families have engaged with educators around those issues. So I don't know if I could just maybe ask each of you to turn on your mics for a moment, to just any final comments you might give on those points.
Well, I'll just jump in to say that the bulk of the research on family engagement with young children suggests that trying to turn family members into tutors, kind of doing formal academic work with their children, hasn't in most studies really resulted in gains for children. So that doesn't seem to be the way to do it. In contrast, a lot of family engagement approaches that have been tested in research and found to be effective draw on the things that families are already doing in their home and just enhance the language and literacy within those. So for example, in one study, the families attended workshops where there was a workshop on how do you incorporate literacy into your kitchen activity, into cooking, and when children are, enjoying their meal, and how do you incorporate language and literacy into running errands each week? And that had positive effects on language and literacy outcomes compared to a control group. So but just say that having that angle of really trying to weave things that we want families to do into the context of their daily lives and learning from families, so it's really bi-directional, is very important based on research.
Very interesting. Thank you, Nell.
I just chime in quickly to say, I couldn't agree more now. That's the kind of stuff we've also been doing by taking learning into the community. And with community members, we've been rebuilding bus stops and sidewalks and putting signs in supermarkets. And crazy though it seems, all of a sudden parents who are helping us to build these structures get very excited. And we are indeed seeing the outcomes in children that have been very, very positive in reading and math. One example is we're working in the city of Santa Ana right now, and the dominant language is Spanish. And while we were building some of the stuff for the supermarket, they said, do you guys mind? Couldn't we just put the weights in grams instead of in pounds? And we went, absolutely. And the minute we did that, what did we find? People start talking about how much the tomatoes weigh. So I think as long as you can fit into what people want to do in their own natural environment, some of this just comes naturally, and then it's our job to help them reflect on what they've done.
One of the things that we've done is, which was something that was started during the pandemic, was we created a text messaging and video platform for our parents and teachers, so that parents could upload videos of their children doing things, and they and the teachers could text each other, and it's translated into 100 different languages, and it's simultaneously translated, so you feel like you're texting somebody in your language and they're responding back to you. And we found that really changed a lot of teachers' relationships with their parents, because they felt they could discuss what they saw happening. And I think videos are really very useful in that way, because it's something that you're just looking at your child's development. So you can share that together.
And I'll just add to what's been said. I think one of that bi-directional is really important. And one way to do that is actually welcoming families in different ways into the classroom and into the learning, not as a tutor per se, but as a partner with our educators and our school communities. And so one strategy we use that is one of the most powerful ways to transform a whole school community is what we call gallery walks. And they happen regularly at the end of any kind of big thematic learning experience. And parents are welcomed in, whole families are welcomed in. We tend to suggest they do them at drop off or pickup time, not at the evening necessarily when other people are doing other thing or other, children need to be cared for in the house, but really just open and consistent throughout the year, not just open school, house, but welcoming the families into the classroom. And the students are the docents, and you have, preschoolers walking their kids around and showing their parents, their family members, their older siblings, all the different areas and the things they've learned. And it creates this incredible opening and just really, we've had teachers tell us that they felt really nervous in the beginning, and then by the end of the year, their classroom doors are open in ways that historically, the parents stop at the door and drop the kid off. And so just really making that bi-directional partnership and encouraging families to be part of the whole learning experience. I'm going to drop a video as well that shows some of that.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you, Deb and Kathy, and now some incredibly beautiful guidance that you've offered here. We're going to wrap this panel up and just say a big thanks to the four of you for your insights today. And I'm going to move, but there will be some Q&A to come later, but I'm going to move us into a discussion now with three educators who can really, I think, help to bring this down even more toward what's really happening in the classroom, what they have experienced. So I will just take a minute now to introduce our three commentators who are on the ground experiencing this every day. First is Cynthia Crespo. She's a kindergarten. I'll describe all three of them for you, and then we'll go into conversation. Cynthia Crespo was a kindergarten special education teacher in her 14th year, teaching for the Department of Education in New York City. And she spent most of her career teaching kindergarten and first grade, and strives for her instruction to be equitable and rigorous for all her students, and she graduated from Long Island University with a master's degree in urban education. Then we have Simone Kelvin. She's a general education teacher in Brooklyn, New York. She teaches in an integrated co-teaching kindergarten classroom for New York City schools. She has 10 years of teaching experience, which also includes the experience of teaching in a 3-year-old classroom. And last but not least, we have Luis Gallego. Thanks so much for being with us. Luis is a senior partnership development manager who works to provide high-quality education to preschool and kindergarten students through the Tools of the Mind curriculum that you've heard about, that Deb Leong described. Working for Tools of the Mind since 2014, Luis has brought 12 years of experience teaching preschool and elementary English and Spanish. So glad to have you all with us. And I know that there's been a lot of conversation already about different strategies you can use. I wanted to maybe just start by getting some of your own first reactions to this discussion that you just heard. Do any of the strategies that you heard described really resonate for you or stick out for you as something that is particularly important to call out? And maybe I'll start with you. With Cynthia, and then we'll just go from Cynthia to Simone to Luis.
Thank you so much. For me personally, I have been teaching kindergarten for a long time, and I can say that the shift in education and how we're teaching children is different. I think for us, as we are coming back from a pandemic year, building a classroom community is very important, like building that community with parents, having that socialization like with the children and them building those relationships with their friends inside the classroom. I feel like without that work, things are not going to get done. Children need to be safe inside their classroom. They need to understand the world outside of their classroom as far as their community as well. And in our kindergarten classroom, we are shifting the way of the typical kindergarten of how, we used to teach like a mini lesson and then kids will go practice the skill, where kids now they are the real teachers. They are coming up with we are introducing the themes and they are coming up with how they want to execute what they're learning. So it's a lot of collaboration. It's a lot of like their thinking, a lot of like, how do they want to present what they're learning? Definitely through like guided play, like kids are using materials that they bring from home, materials that they see inside the classroom, integrating like technology into the concepts that they want to teach others.
So you might come back to the technology point too, because that would be intriguing for others to hear. But let's go to you, Simone.
I think we're seeing definitely seeing the effects of the pandemic, but then also coming to terms with a lot of the assumptions that we had about kindergartners in general. Now I know for myself, especially seeing the students that I have this year, and in comparison to the students that we had last year who may have had maybe preschool exposure before we met them. But the students we have now have the only maybe source of education that they've had has been at home. These are the pandemic babies who've been home for the past 3 years, who haven't been socializing, who haven't had those really important first interactions with their peers. So we're spending a lot of time intentionally building their SEL skills, intentionally building their relationship with letter sounds and how they can identify with numbers, because for a lot of kids, they've just been surviving with their families for the past 3 years. And so now we're kind of figuring out who we need them to be as learners and as linguists, and kind of coming to terms or like reconciling what we as adults need to do in order to get them there.
Yeah, it's really important to recognize what families have just been through in those years and what that meant for the children in those families. So Luis, any big takeaways for you, things that were top of mind as you heard the previous discussion?
Actually, a lot. I mean, this conversation have been so rich, and I think one big idea that keeps ringing in my mind, connecting to some of the ideas, is really thinking play as a very complex, rich process that it needs to be fostered, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be taught. A lot of the times we think of play just as like children sending them to the center and go and play, but actually through this conversation we've heard that no, it actually has to be guided. So I actually have a really cool story of my time as a teacher with the students that I want to use to highlight this. And I was a tools teacher, so actually through tools I learned how to do all that guided play and my kids got to a point where they got really good at playing. And one day a couple of kids were just saying like, oh maestro, can we pretend that we are going to Mexico and we make a bus? And I was like, okay, this is not part of like the plan for today, but let's see where it goes. And it turns into this very complex scenario where all my class just became into join into this scenario where they created a bus, and we were living in Denver. I was teaching in Denver, and they will go back to Mexico. So all the kids start taking the roles of their families and like their kids and taking the chicken and all the food. And then in the middle of the road, there was an accident and they have to get off and like fix the bus. And it was fascinating. But and then what happened was like, I was able to reflect, and because I had all this experience and knowledge about how to foster play, I was able to look at the situation in a very different way. And I want to connect it to what Dr. Duke is saying in terms of how you can incorporate some of that, because I had that vision of play and how important it was. It really allowed me to really thinking of like, oh wow, this is from the social science perspective. This is a really good opportunity to work on like social on social studies concepts, and then from science you can work to all of those kind of things. But also connected to what Dr. Hertzwitz is saying in terms of also knowing your students. That opportunity taught me so much of their lives and their experiences that I was fascinated. I was like, oh wow, so my kids and I learned that every summer my kids actually go back to Mexico, and and I was like, wow. But I was able to do that because my kids, one, had the skills to play and develop that and bring their lives into a classroom. But at the same time, it really strengthened those relationships. A lot of the times, and I think Cynthia said it very well, the students become the teacher. In that moment, the students were giving me this beautiful lesson of their lives, and an opportunity for me to like really think, oh wow, like I can work all these concepts through play and like really help them with language, with social interactions. But something very important to highlight is we got to a point, not just because we were playing, but because we were really looking and approaching play from a very complex skills and allowing the kids to do that. So when you allow the kids to do that, actually that takes them to a whole other level. Later on is going to impact all those other academic skills.
Yes, thank you. And we've just got maybe time for one more question for the three of you. And you can take this any way you'd like, but given that these young students today are coming from so many different places in terms of their own learning, in terms of learning how to learn, they may have bring different challenges to the table. How do you use this, maybe the strategies we've heard today or the strategies in your own classroom? How do you meet children where they are And also, how do you do that when you have, say, 20 of them in the classroom? I mean, these are incredibly kind of big challenges here, but I'd be curious your take on that.
So I guess like for us, you really need to observe them. You need to get to understand them. So like something that we do in the beginning of the year, like we have like the parents fill out like a survey, you know, like, is there anything that we should know about your child? Like just like, what do they like? What are some things that they don't like? And it kind of helps us like understand like how the parents view their children, you know, because we always hear like, oh, well, my child doesn't behave like that at home. So it's kind of giving you like a lens of like how parents view their children, but then also seeing the different type of, you know, relationship that the kids have on themselves. So like when we are looking at children and we're trying to figure out like what's best for them, you really need to understand them. You really need to look at them. You really need to look at all their strengths. And if they are showing some difficulties, like really like zoning in and not looking at it as, you know, like this is an issue, but like, oh, you know what, let's practice these strategies so that we can do some stuff to highlight some of the stuff that you might be struggling with. So I think like the biggest thing for us is like really getting to know your children, knowing the language that they come from, even like having like cultural, like different books inside of our classroom, like bringing parents into the classroom, like having them as a partnership to figuring out like what strategies I can use best to help your child, and even giving those parents the strategies that they can use at home.
Excellent. Yeah. And I just love this theme of parents and family engagement within the kindergarten classroom just keeps coming through in these conversations. Simone, let me ask you, what strategies might you use to meet children where they are and recognizing their all those different needs they have?
I think the first thing to really consider when you're saying you want to meet a child where they are is to be authentic in that and not meet them with expectations. So to kind of get an idea, of course, who the child is, who they are at home, who their family is, what their entry points are. And then, of course, you know, we do our initial assessments, and it's not an assessment to pinpoint deficits. It's, I need to know what you know, or how I can meet you, where I can meet you. How does this speak to my grouping? How is this going to help us build community in the classroom? Because we want all of our students to feel like a strong member of our classroom community. We don't want people to feel like a hindrance. We don't want any of our students to feel like they don't know as much, or they don't have as much, or their background isn't as strong as someone else's. We want the equitable experience to be valid for everybody. And so we not only want it to be equitable, like, you know, what the saying is like, equity isn't equal. And it doesn't have to be the same thing for everybody, but that everybody does need to get what they need. And so we definitely take that into consideration in meeting children where they are. Yes, including the families in our practice, inviting them in as often as we can, inviting them to have their input. Let us know what kinds of things that your child's into, things that they're scared of, things that we can maybe avoid, some things we might want to highlight. How are you an active member of your community? What kinds of things are you guys doing at home that we might be able to highlight in the classroom as well? I know we're coming up on, we're inviting scientists into our classrooms. So the first thing we did was reach out to our families. Hey, are any of you guys scientists, or do you know any scientists that we can have come in and talk to the kids? And we kind of like go from there. And the curriculum that we're using is really helpful in that. So we do love it for that as well.
Excellent. And to you, Luis, and you'll close us out here, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A from the whole audience. But yeah, in terms of meeting children where they are, you've already given us this beautiful story of the kids in the bus and creating the bus. But if there's anything more you want to add about how you do that in your.
Yes, and I think especially connecting it to kinder, in looking towards first grade and like the upper grades. And I think one story that is very important is really creating a community of learners, where again, the children change this idea that children are like the tabula rasa, that they don't come with ideas or previous knowledge, but they actually come with a lot. But also giving them opportunities to work together, to talk among themselves, to negotiate meaning, and not being 100% directed by the teachers. A lot of the times, I think, and in traditional teaching, that's what we have, is the teacher instructing the students versus the teacher mediating or guiding that learning. So using, for example, some Dr. Leon had fantastic examples of how to do that with the students, with learning goals. So the learning goals, not only having it as like my learning goal, but also having the opportunity to share that with my students. So other students help me achieve those goals. Is not only the teacher, but because I have a relationship with my peers, with my other students, we talk about, the children talk about their own learning goals and support each other. And that really creates that community of learners. And that also is going to lead to children being able to guide their own learning, because they're not waiting on the teacher to provide support, but, oh, wait, I have my friend that I can also ask help. And because I'm talking with my friend, like, children actually engage in very rich conversations about learning. And I think it was Simone that, or Cynthia, that also said observe children, because when you do that, when you observe children, when you step back a little bit and just observe children, you actually realize a lot of those things. And it's fascinating to see how children talk about their own learning when they're talking with their peers versus when they're talking with the students. So really creating that community where of learners, where the students are supporting each other, not only getting support from the teacher.
Excellent. Oh, big thanks to the three of you. So stay with us. We're going to go to Q&A, and if our presenters also can come back on camera. So we'll have all of you available to answer some of these incredible questions that have come in. I'm going to go to one that's kind of a combination from a variety of different questions that have come in. Michelle asks, how do we get school systems to embrace this way of running a kindergarten classroom through guided play? Everything in kindergarten is really flipped to teaching children in ways that first grade has taught. If that's the case, then maybe it's most kindergarten teachers, they're using excessive amounts of worksheets and drill and skill and drill kind of teaching. Children are kind of sitting at desks completing these worksheets. I'm sure many of you understand this image that is being painted by this question. So this can be stressful for children and families. And Jen adds to this question asking, how do we move teachers away from those practices that are not effective? They hold tight to some of these practices. They see them as kind of their favorites. And it can be difficult for them to move or to change their own practices with children. So this is kind of a two-part questions. How do we get school systems to change, and how do we get educators to recognize that they can move away from some of their old practices? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll jump in. I was seeing that theme of administrators and how do we support teachers to do this critical work. And we often think about our work with leaders and administrators as being trying to create the conditions for teachers to do the very difficult, complex, magical work they do every day. We don't want it to be despite the principals. We actually want it to be supported by the principals, right? And so it's really critical, I think, across the board to ensure that when teachers are being asked to do anything, that we're working also with those that support them, the principals, district leaders. And so, this is not an easy answer. I will just say, and I think others that are other of my colleagues on the panel have also approached, when they work with schools and with teachers, they work with the system at large and not teacher by teacher, because we can put all our resources out there, and there have been many resources before all of our wonderful centers and books and et cetera. But you know, teachers on their own, the challenge is too hard. There's too much coming at them all the time. And so, you know, Luis was just saying, observing your students, or you know, all the three teachers have talked about the work to partner with families. This takes time and energy, and that requires teachers have the time and energy to do the most meaningful work in their job, the planning, the taking, you know, the idea that a student comes with about a bus and going with it, or students, a student group, and going with it and being able to bring the resources in to make that learning experience rich, to setting up this kind of play and exploration. And you know, I love the picture that Kathy painted of you know, the drops of water. I mean, those kinds of activities take a long time. So I guess I would say we need to engage not leaders just as leaders, or principals as principals, and teach them how to be good managers, but really ensure that they can't sit through PD necessarily with all their teachers. But when teachers go to PD, there needs to be an effort to include administrators. We work with district leaders, mid-level and senior level when we work with in implementation of any partnership. So really making sure that our work in the field is systemic and creates the conditions so teachers can do what is most meaningful, which is the work directly with students and families.
I would say too that for us, having proof, just because you're using play, you still have proof that children learned. So we have these learning records that they write, where, you know, after playing a game, they write the words that they practice. When they do this play and they dramatize a story, they write facts and things that they want to incorporate. And those, what we found is having a record of what the child has learned is helpful for the child, because the child sees that they've learned, but also it's been very helpful to tie that to end of the year progress for teachers and parents and administrators. So I don't think that anything that we've talked about doesn't mean that you're not documenting that children are actually growing and learning the things that we've all talked about, like all the literacy activities that Nell's talked about. Those can be documented even in a classroom where children are playing.
And Deb, just a follow-up question to you on that, just recognizing that these are kindergartners. I think I've seen some of these documents, these records. It doesn't mean that children have to know how to write yet, right? So it could be that
No.
they're drawing
Right.
it. Just wanted to clarify that for those who might be thinking, gosh, that's a lot for a kindergartner that's, you know, at that early stage. So yeah, it's terrific. Anyone else want to add? We've got another question I can pull up here about use of time, but I did want to just make sure that especially for our educators with us, if there's anything you might want to say about how to help systems, principals, or even educators change it and adapt in some of these new ways.
Yeah, I think I just want to highlight one piece. And I think part of the change is for us to really rethink how we see play, and sort of demystify it as just play for the sake of it, but really for this age is a really high cognitive skill, high cognitive abilities that children need to have in order to set the foundation for the future, So really thinking, sometimes teachers say like, oh, I don't think this is going to work. And a lot of the times comes because of they have this idea of play that doesn't really match what we really aim in. So when we really frame it differently as guided play with these very specific characteristics, I think really dig it. And that also it's the same for administrators, is for them to really rethink and see play from a different lens, because a lot of the times it's just play, especially now that we have technology and like cell phones and all of that. Really highlighting play is important, but play is a wide range of things, and really focusing on the play that leads to that development.
Yeah, I would just want to chime in a little bit here that in many ways, the most convincing thing that we've done with schools is that what we're doing isn't working so well. On the one hand, the kids aren't getting it. We need only look at, like the report cards that keep coming out. And it's been a long time of not getting it. And over the years, what we do is we keep buckling down and saying, oh my God, it's supposed to be lots more of this, lots more of this. And I think that kind of takes away also the joy from the kids and the joy from the teachers. And so I agree with Deb that if we can show, and we certainly are out there trying, show that you're not going to lose anything, but you might gain a lot. That is, your kids will do well in reading and learning phonics and all the stuff that Nell mentioned, that honest to God, if there were one thing in my whole field of psychology and education and science of learning that I would put my stake in the ground on, it's that if you don't have those skills that Nell mentioned, you're not going to be a reader. But I'd also suggest that if you don't have the language skills to support it, before you go off and do all of this wonderful reading stuff, that you may also be lost. So it has to be twinned. And it works if we can come up with a systemic, almost Anya type and Deborah type thematic approach. So one is to say, hey, we have something that works, and teachers are professionals. And we wouldn't trust business people if we had to take our kid's tooth out, right? If we'd go to a dentist. And so I think maybe we should start recognizing the professionalism of our teachers and trying to do things in education systems that support our teachers. So if the administrators think they'll win and get their test scores, and they'll retain their teachers, which is a big deal today, and the kids will have deeper learning, I think you might have a win-win equation.
I wanted to have been on this one. I know from my observations, it's a lot easier to, as an educator, do what you've always done. It's a lot easier. It's a lot more comfortable to do what you think has always worked. And for a lot of educators who come from a place of developers or curriculum writers, they've been out of the classroom and they're out of touch and they don't know what works and they don't know what we're going through and this isn't working and these people are clueless. But there has been such a shift in the way that curricula is being developed, and that it's being developed by people who actually understand how children learn and how they should be taught, and that these things have been working. And I think it's going to take a lot of discomfort for people to step outside of their comfort zones, to step out of the box, or even at least think outside of the box, to try something new, and then also hold each other accountable. We've had to have a lot of accountability meetings on our grade team, just based upon, wanting to do things with fidelity and wanting to have like a cohesive unit and recognizing the things that are working and pointing out the things that are not working, and calling them out by name, and, kind of having everybody understand why they're not working. And so it's going to take a lot of, yes, collaboration with your admin, yes, collaboration with your families, but it's also going to be like a lot of soul searching. Like, why did you get into this profession? Well, like, you'll have to kind of recalibrate yourself as an educator to really understand the why, your why, and then also like what the end goal is. We all want our kindergartners to be reading at the end of the year. Some may be reading at a higher level than others, and that's okay. But at the end of it, we want our kids to have a good time, and we want them to gain experiences that are going to take them further in life, and in their educational careers as well.
Right. And now I just want to double check that there might not be, given all of the work that you've done specific around literacy and helping educators see different ways of doing it, if there's anything else you might want to add in there too.
Well, something we haven't talked about that I think is really important is that chasm between pre-K and K. Some people say gap, but I really think chasm is probably a better term. And many of you hear about the fade out of preschool effects. So there's growing evidence that most of that fade out happens in kindergarten. So trying to get a better connection between pre-K and K seems to me to be one of the big policy priorities for those policymakers who are on this call. There are lots of ways to do that. There's growing evidence that co-locating our preschools where our kindergartens are is beneficial. So that's one move for sure. Professional learning opportunities and coaching that spans pre-K and K rather than what happens in a lot of districts, which is pre-K teachers get a completely different set of professional learning experiences. Looking for different instructional techniques that are effective for children in both pre-K and K, and you've heard about some of them today. Literacy enriched sociodramatic play has support in both preschool and in kindergarten. Another one is interactive writing, which is somewhat similar to what Deborah was describing. Interactive read alouds, a certain way of reading aloud to children that really supports comprehension and vocabulary development. Explicitly teaching the alphabet, not through long lectures, which does not appear to work, but through brief and playful opportunities is effective in both pre-K and K. So I think that I just want to add to the conversation how important that pre-K piece is.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to throw out one last question. It's kind of a combination again of several that have come in, and then we'll have to close out. So this will be answer really quickly if you have an answer to this. We've had some questions about the discussion of time, obviously, and how it's hard to fit it all in or how to do it. And also questions about coming in about how to facilitate guided play throughout the day. Should it be in small groups? Should there be fluid learning going on across the whole classroom? I guess some of this comes down to at what point is there a cross classroom learning? At what point is best for small group learning? And maybe our educators could have the last word on this, since I know some of this is what you're dealing with every day as well. But if you might want to take that question.
I can speak to that. So for us, we can say that the majority of our literacy that kids are actively in guided play is they are working in small groups. So they have whatever, if, for an example, we just finished a unit on kindergarten care. So kids were learning about how the importance of learning care through the eyes of Dr. Martin Luther King, being caring for your friends, doing self-care for yourself. So kids were actively creating stuff because the overall project was a care basket and giving it to somebody in the community. So as kids are actively doing these little projects that, combine together to the big project, you are able to pull those small groups and working on letter sounds, so that when you're doing your interactive writing, kids are using the skills that they're learning in their phonics instruction to write thank you letters to the recipient of the care basket. So we are seeing a lot small group play is very important. And kids are learning from each other, and it's developing these deep, rich conversations that kids are not learning something and then forgetting it. It's throughout the whole year, and kids are relating to, last year we saw a lot of, at the end of the year, kids were still relating to some of the things that we saw in the beginning.
We'll leave it with that great image and that real positivity there. It's learning to learn that we're hearing about throughout all of these examples. Just want to say a big thanks to the presenters and the commentators. who have been with us today, and to the fantastic questions and discussion in the chat. I mean, oh my gosh, it's so rich. There's so much learning going on. So, and just to say thanks for letting me be part of this. Laura will be back soon. And just a big thanks to Laura Bornfriend for helping to organize all of this as well. So I'm going to pass it over now to Hillary. And thanks for being with everybody.
Absolutely. And I want to say thank you to you, Lisa, our presenters, our educators, our audience for the conversation. It's been a wonderful afternoon here, at least on the East Coast, if you're in afternoon time. But we would encourage you to stay tuned for the rest of this series in January and February. I am dropping the sign up link in the chat so you can share it with somebody else who might be interested in this topic, who needs to learn more about kindergarten. We have several more sessions that will come in 2023. And so consider signing up for that, as well as join us for our upcoming sessions next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. Pacific Time. We have responding in real time data to inform action for schools and communities. And then on December 13th, we have two options for you at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time or 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time. We will have the United Way and Campaign for Grade Level Reading, Aligning for Impact in Education. Or also on the 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time and 12 p.m. Pacific Time, we will have Following the Money, $190 billion to confront challenges, seize opportunities. So I will share the links one more time in the chat box for you, but please sign up and join us. Thank you so much for your attendance today. And it was a pleasure to be with you all.